You clicked on this because of that title, right? The alien queen was pronounced dead. Dead is dead. There's no coming back from dead. So what exactly are we watching for the next 20 minutes? Stay with me, because what you're about to hear isn't a resurrection story. It's a story about a man who refused to accept a diagnosis, and an entire alien empire that had already started mourning. By the end of this part, you'll understand exactly why dead doesn't always mean what you think it means. Let's get into it. Corporal Ethan Marsh had seen death up close more times than he could count on both hands. He'd zipped body bags in sandstorms on deployments nobody back home ever heard about. He'd held a friend's hand while the light went out of his eyes on a transport that never made it home. Death had a smell, a stillness, a weight that settled into a room and refused to leave. He knew death. So when he stepped through the shattered doorway of the royal chamber on Velcara Station and found the alien queen laid out on a slab of black stone, surrounded by 12 robed attendants chanting in a language that sounded like glass grinding against glass, his first instinct wasn't horror. It was doubt. Something about the scene didn't sit right in his gut. 3 days earlier, none of this had been part of the plan. Ethan was a combat medic assigned to the Joint Earth Coalition relief mission, the kind of posting nobody fought over. Velcara wasn't a war zone. It was a dying star system on the edge of Coalition space, home to the Ithari, a species most humans had only seen in briefing photos. Tall, silver-skinned, eyes like liquid mercury, a civilization old enough to make Earth's oldest cities look like sandcastles. The Ithari had been quietly falling apart for a decade. A wasting sickness moved through their bloodline, something in their genetic architecture unraveling generation after generation. Human medicine had nothing to offer them directly. Their biology was too different, too strange, but Earth had sent doctors anyway, mostly as a goodwill gesture, mostly because the Coalition asked nicely, and nobody wanted to be the species that said no. Ethan hadn't expected to matter. He'd expected paperwork, quarantine protocols, maybe a few awkward diplomatic dinners where he smiled and nodded at food he couldn't pronounce. Then the station's reactor housing cracked during a supply run, and half the western wing lost pressure in under 4 minutes, and Ethan found himself the only medical officer within reach of the royal quarter when the alarms started screaming. He ran toward the noise. That was always the mistake that defined him, running toward the noise instead of away from it. His squad back home used to joke that Marsh had his priorities backwards, that a smart man ran the other direction when things started exploding. Ethan never found that particularly funny. He'd stopped being a smart man a long time ago, somewhere around the 3rd time he watched someone die because help arrived 90 seconds too late. He wasn't going to be 90 seconds too late again. By the time he reached the royal chamber, the attendants had already begun the morning rites. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the posture of grief in any language: the bowed heads, the slow rhythmic swaying, the way sound in a room changes when everyone in it has already accepted the worst. The queen lay motionless on the black slab. Her skin, usually a shimmering pale silver according to the briefing photos, had dulled to something closer to ash. Her chest didn't rise. Her eyes were closed, her hands folded with a formality that only comes after someone has already stopped being a person and started being a body. An attendant turned toward him, mercury eyes narrowing with something between grief and irritation. "You should not be here, human," the attendant said, the Coalition translator implant in Ethan's ear rendering the words with only a half-second delay. "The Astrahl Vareth has passed. This is a sacred moment. Leave us to grieve her." Astrahl Vareth. Ethan didn't know the title yet, didn't know it meant something close to Queen of the Unbroken Light, a name earned through centuries of holding a crumbling empire together through sheer, stubborn will. All he knew was that a woman was lying on a stone slab, declared gone, and something in his training was screaming that the room was wrong. "How long has she been down?" Ethan asked, already crossing the floor, already reaching for the scanner clipped to his vest. "Nearly an hour," the attendant said. Her heart song ended. "There is nothing left to save." Heart song. Ethan filed that away. Whatever the Ithari used to measure life, it apparently had a name that sounded like poetry instead of biology. "An hour," he repeated. "You checked for a pulse? Vitals? Anything?" "We do not need your primitive instruments to know death," the attendant said, sharper now. "Our physicians confirmed it. The heart song requires resonance. Hers has gone silent. There is no error here, human." only your unwillingness to accept what is plain in front of you." Ethan didn't argue. Arguing wasted time, and time was the one thing he refused to waste around a body, dead or alive. He knelt beside the slab anyway, ignoring the murmur of protest rippling through the attendants, and pressed his scanner against the Queen's throat where a human pulse point would sit. The device blinked amber, not green, not red. Amber undefined, unreadable, a signal too faint and too foreign for his equipment to categorize with any confidence. That amber light did something to him. It cracked something open behind his ribs, some old and familiar recklessness he'd sworn off after the last time it nearly got him court-martialed. "She's not human," he said slowly, more to himself than to the room. "So maybe your definition of dead and mine aren't the same thing either." "Do not touch her," the attendant hissed, stepping forward, and for the first time Ethan noticed the ceremonial blade at the attendant's hip, the kind of weapon that existed for exactly one purpose. The rites have begun. To interrupt them before the passing flame is lit would be a desecration beyond forgiveness. Ethan looked past the attendant to the far end of the chamber, where two younger Ithari were carrying an enormous brazier toward the slab, flames already curling hungrily inside it. Passing flame. He didn't need a translator to understand what that meant. In about 90 seconds, whatever debate was happening in this room would become permanently, irreversibly moot. He looked back down at the Queen's face. Up close, stripped of the ceremony and the grief and the ancient title, she looked almost peaceful, almost human. In the strange universal way that stillness makes every species look the same. But her jaw was clenched, faintly, in a way that dead things didn't do. Dead things didn't hold tension. Dead things let go. "She's clenching her jaw," Ethan said aloud, louder this time, cutting through the chanting. "Living tissue does that under duress. Dead tissue doesn't hold tension like that." "I need 30 seconds before anyone lights that fire." "You dare? I'm not asking for a debate," Ethan said, and something in his voice must have carried enough conviction, enough of that stubborn Marsh unwillingness to walk away from a body while there was still a question mark hanging over it, because the room actually paused. Just for a second. Just long enough. He pressed two fingers against the side of her throat, searching for whatever passed for a pulse point in Ithari anatomy, and felt it. Faint, irregular, nothing like a heartbeat he'd ever trained for. But not nothing. "There's something," he said. "It's weak, it's slow, but there's something moving under her skin that shouldn't be moving if she's actually gone." The attendants erupted into overlapping voices, Ithari words tumbling over each other too fast for the translator to keep pace, grief curdling instantly into something closer to outrage. One of them reached for Ethan's arm to physically drag him away from the slab. That was when the Queen's eyes opened. Not fully. Not dramatically. Just a sliver of silver beneath heavy lids, unfocused, searching, landing for one suspended heartbeat directly on Ethan's face. The chamber went utterly silent. The attendant holding the ceremonial blade froze mid-motion, mouth open. No words left in any language for what had just happened in front of 24 witnesses who had, 10 minutes earlier, been ready to burn her body. Ethan didn't move either. He just stared back into those half-open silver eyes, feeling something settle in his chest that had nothing to do with medical protocol and everything to do with the sudden, dizzying realization that he had absolutely no idea what he had just started. Somewhere behind him, someone whispered a word he didn't recognize yet. A word that would follow him for the rest of his life on this station. Impossible. Ethan Marsh had never much cared for that word. He was about to spend the next several days proving exactly why. Quick gut check before we dive back in. You're probably assuming the Empire welcomed her back with open arms. Right? A queen wakes up from the dead. Everybody celebrates. Roll credits. That's not what happens here. What happens next is worse, and honestly, more interesting. Let's go. She didn't speak for 3 days. Ethan stayed by the medical cot they'd finally allowed him to move her onto, over the loud, bitter objections of at least 4 members of the Ithari court who still weren't convinced this wasn't some kind of blasphemy. The Queen Kaelith Vantheon, Astrahl Vareth of the Ithari Dominion, a title that took Ethan 2 full days to say correctly, drifted in and out of something that wasn't quite sleep and wasn't quite consciousness. Her vitals crept up slowly, stubbornly, like a fire that refused to catch properly no matter how much kindling you threw at it. He barely left her side. Partly because his own command structure hadn't figured out what to do with him yet, and partly because some part of him, the part that had run toward the noise on Velcara Station instead of away from it, refused to leave a patient in a room full of people who'd been ready to burn her an hour earlier. That part of him made a lot of enemies in a very short amount of time. Regent Drassen was the first and by far the loudest. He was old, even by Ithari standards, silver skin gone the color of tarnished steel, eyes that had watched 3 generations of the royal line rise and fall. He'd served as senior advisor to Kaelith's mother before her, and he wore that history like armor. "You do not understand what you interrupted," Drassen told Ethan on the second day, cornering him in the narrow observation corridor outside the medical bay. His voice was calm in the specific way that only barely restrained anger can be calm. "The passing flame is not ceremony for its own sake, human. It is release. When the heart song ends, the soul begins its unbinding from the body. What you have done, what your instruments have done, has trapped her between states. Living, but unbound. Do you understand what that costs a person?" Ethan didn't back down, though something in the old man's certainty needled at him more than he wanted to admit. "I understand. A scanner told me there was still activity. I understand. I've watched enough people die to know the difference between a body giving up and a body running out of time. Hers hadn't given up." "Your scanner is a human tool built for human bodies," Drassen said. "It read noise and called it life." "Then explain." Her eyes opening, Ethan said. "Explain that with your ceremony." Drassen had no answer for that. Not one he was willing to give. Anyway, he simply turned and walked away, robes trailing behind him like a closing door. Ethan understood, even then, that he'd just made an enemy who mattered. On the 4th day, Kaelith woke up properly. Ethan was adjusting the IV line, modified, painstakingly, by the station's 2 overworked Ithari physicians and himself, cobbling together human fluids and Ithari biochemistry into something her body could actually use without rejecting when her hand closed around his wrist. Not weakly, not the fragile grip of someone barely alive, firm enough to make him freeze. "You're the one," she said. Her voice was low, rough from disuse, but there was an unmistakable clarity underneath it, the voice of someone used to being obeyed. The translator caught up half a beat late, but Ethan understood the tone before the words even landed. "The one who refused to let them light the flame. I'm the one who thought a jaw shouldn't clench like that if there's nobody left inside to clench it," Ethan said, because apparently even face-to-face with royalty, he couldn't resist being exactly, unhelpfully himself. Something flickered across her face. Not quite a smile. Something more careful than that, more assessing, like she was recalculating everything she'd assumed about the strange, stubborn human who'd apparently pulled her back from whatever threshold she'd been standing on. "Do you know what you interrupted?" she asked. "Your regents explained it to me, several times." Loudly, "Drassen believes the old ways keep us safe," Kaelith said. "He is not entirely wrong. Tradition is the only thing holding this court together while my people waste away 1 generation at a time. But he is also not entirely right, and I suspect you already understand that better than he does." Ethan didn't answer right away. He was still trying to reconcile the woman in front of him, sharp-eyed, imperious, even flat on her back with a needle in her arm, with the ash-gray body he'd found on that stone slab 4 days earlier. "Why were they so sure you were gone?" he asked instead. "Your heart song, or whatever they call it. What actually happened to you?" Kaelith's expression shifted, just slightly, into something guarded. "The wasting," she said. "It comes for all of us eventually. It came for my mother, her mother before her. It moves faster in those who carry the crown, though none of our physicians have ever explained why. I collapsed 3 days before you arrived, and by every measure my people understand, I had already crossed over. Except you hadn't. Except I hadn't," she agreed. "Which either means your primitive scanner is wrong about everything my physicians have believed for 6 centuries, or she stopped herself, or," Ethan pressed, "or something about the wasting itself is not what we think it is," she said quietly. "And I would very much like to know which, before it finishes what it started." Word of the Queen's recovery spread through the station faster than either of them expected, and not in the way anyone hoped. Within 2 days, factions Ethan hadn't even known existed started surfacing, nobles who'd already begun quietly repositioning themselves for succession, now scrambling to walk back private conversations that suddenly looked like treason. A junior physician named Vesa, barely out of training, became one of the only Ithari on staff willing to openly work alongside Ethan, mostly out of sheer scientific curiosity about how a human scanner had caught something 6 centuries of Ithari medicine had missed. "They're saying you defied the old laws to save her," Vesa told him one evening. Hunched over shared medical data in the cramped side lab that had become their unofficial research post. "Some are calling it a miracle. Others are calling it an abomination. Regent Drassen is calling it grounds to have you removed from the station entirely." "Can he actually do that?" "He's petitioning the coalition liaison as we speak," Vesa said, not looking up from the readouts. "Officially, on the basis that human interference in Ithari's sacred rights violates the non-interference clause of the relief agreement." Unofficially, she hesitated. "Unofficially?" "Unofficially, I think he's afraid of what happens if people start believing the wasting sickness can be beaten. An empire that has spent 6 centuries preparing to die slowly does not know what to do with sudden hope. Hope is destabilizing, Corporal Marsh, especially to men who have built their entire authority around managing decline gracefully." Ethan sat with that for a long moment. He thought about every commanding officer he'd ever served under who preferred a controlled, predictable loss over an uncontrolled, unpredictable win. It wasn't such an alien concept after all. And Kaelith? Where does she land in all this? Vesa's expression softened, just slightly, into something almost sympathetic. "She is the only one of them brave enough, or reckless enough, to want the truth more than she wants the throne to stay comfortable. That is either going to save this station, Corporal, or it is going to get both of you killed." That night, Ethan found Kaelith standing at the observation window overlooking the dying star system outside, her silhouette lit by the pale, dimming light of a sun that, according to coalition projections, had maybe another century left before it collapsed entirely. It felt, in that moment, less like a coincidence and more like a metaphor nobody had asked for. "You should be resting," Ethan said, stepping up beside her. "I have been resting for 4 days, Kaelith said, not turning. "Resting is what dying people do while they wait." "I am done waiting, Corporal Marsh." "Ethan," he said. "Just Ethan is fine." She turned to look at him then, silver eyes catching the dim starlight, and for the first time since he'd met her. There was something unguarded in her expression, something that had nothing to do with titles or thrones or 6 centuries of careful, exhausted tradition. "Ethan," she repeated, testing the name the way someone tests unfamiliar ground before trusting their full weight to it. "Tell me honestly, do you believe you can find what is actually killing my people? Not the flame, not the ritual, not the 6 centuries of ceremony my regent has built around watching us fade the actual cause." Ethan looked out at the dying star with her, feeling the weight of the question settle somewhere deep in his chest, somewhere that had nothing to do with medical training and everything to do with the particular, dangerous kind of hope he'd sworn off a long time ago. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I intend to find out, and for what it's worth, Your Grace, I've never once regretted running towards something everyone else told me to leave alone." Behind them, unseen in the shadowed corridor, Regent Drassen watched the two of them standing together at the window, and made a decision that would set the next chapter of this story in motion, one neither Ethan nor Kaelith would see coming until it was already too late to stop. "Before this one wraps up, and I promise you, whatever you think Drassen's next move is going to be, it's not what actually happens. This isn't a story about a villain twirling a mustache. It's a story about a man so afraid of losing control of a dying empire that he'd rather it die slowly and predictably than survive on uncertain terms. Let's finish this." Drassen made his move 3 days later, and he made it through the front door instead of the shadows, which was somehow worse. He called an emergency session of the Ithari court, the first full assembly since Kaelith's collapse, and by the time Ethan heard about it, invitations had already gone out to every noble house on the station. Officially, the session was billed as a matter of succession stability. Unofficially, everyone on Velcara understood exactly what it was. A referendum on whether the queen who had come back from the dead was still fit to hold the crown, and whether the human who'd pulled her back deserved to be quietly, permanently removed from the equation. Vesa found Ethan in the side lab an hour before the session, her expression tight in a way he hadn't seen from her before. "He's going to argue that your interference broke the succession rights," she said, setting a data slate down harder than necessary. "If the court agrees that the passing flame should have been lit, then by Ithari law, Kaelith's reign technically ended the moment her heart song stopped. Everything since then, her recovery, her continued rule, becomes null. A technicality, but an old and powerful one. That's insane, Ethan said. She's alive. She's standing in front of them. Being alive was never the requirement, Ethan, Vesa said quietly. Being properly released was. Drasen isn't going to argue she's dead. He's going to argue she should have been allowed to die, and that everything since is illegitimate because of it. Ethan felt something cold settle into his stomach, the particular familiar dread of watching a fight get rigged before it even started. And if the court agrees with him? Vesa didn't answer right away, which was its own kind of answer. Then, by tradition, she finally said, the throne passes to the next eligible line, Drasen's bloodline. The court chamber was nothing like the medical bay or the quiet observation corridors Ethan had spent the last week in. It was vast, tiered, carved from the same black stone as the slab Kaelith had once lain motionless on, ringed with silver-skinned nobles in ceremonial robes who watched Ethan enter at Kaelith's side, with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Kaelith walked upright, steady, dressed not in the ceremonial white of mourning but in deep, unmistakable royal blue, a small, deliberate act of defiance that Ethan understood the second he saw it. She wasn't walking in like someone who needed to prove she was alive. She was walking in like someone who'd never stopped being queen. Drasen stood at the center of the chamber floor, flanked by two of his own physicians, looking every bit the picture of grave, reluctant duty. I do not do this out of malice, Drasen began, his voice carrying easily through the tiered chamber. I do this because our laws exist for a reason. The Astrahl Vareth's heart song ceased. By every measure our people have trusted for 6 centuries. The passing flame should have been lit. It was not, because of the interference of an outsider who does not understand what he disrupted. His eyes flicked, briefly, coldly, to Ethan. I ask this court to consider not whether our queen lives, for clearly she does, but whether a reign interrupted by death, however briefly, however unnaturally reversed, can still be called legitimate. Murmurs rippled through the tiers. Ethan felt the weight of 24 unreadable silver-eyed stares pressing down on him, and for the first time since Velkara Station, he understood exactly how far outside his depth he actually was. He wasn't a diplomat. He wasn't a lawyer. He was a combat medic who'd made a call based on a jaw-clenching wrong, and now an entire empire's succession was balanced on whether that call had been allowed to count. Kaelith stepped forward before anyone could stop her. May I address my own legitimacy? Regent Drasen, she said, or has that also been ruled outside the boundaries of tradition? A tense pause. Drasen inclined his head, stiffly. The floor is yours, your grace, as it always has been. Kaelith turned to face the assembled court, and Ethan watched something settle over her, not the fragile recovering patient from the medical bay, but the ruler who'd held together a crumbling empire for years through sheer refusal to let it fall apart on her watch. 6 centuries ago, she began, the passing flame was created not as a law, but as a mercy. Our ancestors built it because the wasting sickness was, and remains, incurable, because watching someone fade slowly, painfully, over weeks, was crueler than releasing them cleanly at the first sign the body was failing. It was compassion, carved into ritual, carved eventually into law. I do not fault my regent for defending it. I fault him for forgetting why it was built in the first place. She turned, slowly, deliberately, to look directly at Ethan. This human did not defy our ritual out of arrogance. He defied it because he refused to accept an unproven death sentence without confirming it first, a courtesy. I would remind this court that we have never once extended to ourselves. We have spent 6 centuries assuming the wasting sickness is a mystery beyond our understanding, and lighting a merciful flame rather than asking the harder question of whether it could ever be stopped. Her voice hardened. I intend to ask that question, starting now. The chamber went silent in a way that felt different from before, not the silence of shock, but the silence of an old, exhausted argument finally being said out loud by someone with the standing to say it. Drasen's composure cracked, just slightly. You would gamble the stability of this entire empire on the word of one human physician. I would gamble the stability of this empire. Kaelith cut in, voice ringing clear through the chamber. On the chance that my people do not have to keep dying a sickness we have never once seriously tried to cure, because it was easier to build a beautiful ceremony around accepting it instead. The vote, when it came, wasn't unanimous. Ethan hadn't expected it to be. But it was enough nobles swayed by 6 days of watching their queen stand upright. Coherent, unmistakably herself, to outweigh Drasen's argument about broken tradition. The regent didn't storm out. He simply bowed, formally, and withdrew with the particular dignity of a man who knew exactly when a fight was no longer winnable. At least not today. It was Vesa, 2 days later, digging through 6 centuries of buried medical archives with Ethan late into the station's artificial night cycle, who found the thread that mattered. The wasting sickness doesn't attack the body randomly, she said, pushing a data slate toward him, hands unsteady with the particular electricity of a real discovery. It attacks a specific genetic marker, one almost exclusively present in the royal bloodline. Ethan, I think 6 centuries of physicians have been treating this as an unavoidable curse when it might actually be an inherited, treatable condition. We never looked because the flame gave us an answer that stopped us from having to ask the question. Ethan stared at the data, feeling something settle into place that had been circling him since the moment he'd first pressed a scanner to Kaelith's throat. Then we start treating it like a condition, he said. Not a curse. He found Kaelith later that night in the same observation corridor where they'd first stood together, watching the same slow, dying star outside the window. Vesa found something, he said. Something real. It's going to take time, and it's not going to be simple, but I think we actually have a shot at this. Kaelith turned to look at him, and there was something in her expression that hadn't been there in the medical bay. Something that had nothing to do with thrones or crowns or 6 centuries of careful tradition. You keep doing that, she said softly. Doing what? Refusing to walk away from something everyone else has already decided is finished. She stepped closer, close enough that Ethan could see the faint, steady pulse beneath her silver skin, the same pulse he'd once had to search for with his fingertips, praying it was still there. I was gone, Ethan. By every law my people have trusted for 600 years, I was gone. And you looked at a clenched jaw and decided that wasn't good enough evidence. It wasn't, Ethan said quietly. Some things are worth checking twice before you accept them. Some things, Kaelith agreed, are worth staying for, too. Neither of them moved for a long moment. The dying star casting pale light across both their faces. An entire fragile empire's future balanced quietly in the space between them, no longer a question of whether she would survive, but of what they would both choose to build now that she had. And that's the story. A queen who was pronounced dead by every law her people trusted, and a man who looked at her one more time before letting anyone light that flame. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't fighting a war, it's refusing to accept an ending nobody's actually confirmed yet. If this one got you, if you felt that hook in your chest the second her eyes opened on that slab, do me a favor and hit like. Drop a comment telling me what part hit hardest. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe to HFY Soundscape. We've got a lot more where this came from. Thanks for staying till the end. See you in the next one.